Next, we will hear from the Executive Director of Global Partnership to End Violence Against Children, Bapak Howard Taylor, who will be giving his opening speech. Pak Howard, the floor is yours.
That one? Okay, good morning. Something will appear behind me very shortly. It's great to be back in Indonesia. I've only been to Indonesia once before, and it's particularly special to be back now in the company of such fantastic partners as PUSKAPA and the CPC network, but also because Indonesia is a pathfinding country within the global partnership to end violence against children. And I'm going to talk today about three things. I'm going to say a little bit about the global partnership to end violence against children, which, as I said to a less informed audience recently, might just be the longest named, most ambitious, least known partnership in the world. It was an audience of Silicon Valley tech people in the online space. I'm going to say a bit about the partnership. I'm going to say a bit about the opportunity that we see ahead of us, particularly in 2019, but in the next few years, and why this is such a critical moment. I'd go as far as to say I think it's a historical opportunity that we collectively have to move the ball forward on child protection and ending violence against children. And then I'm going to, just for food for thought, at the end, throw out some scenarios, or a scenario, about how we might get to zero by 2030. Marta Santos Payas, the United Nations Secretary General Special Representative for Ending Violence Against Children, talks about getting to zero. That's what we're all here for. We want to get to 0 cases of violence against children from the billion cases a year that we have today. But before I get to those three things, I'm going to say a little bit about my journey to Bali. So it'll contextualize a little bit of the partnership and some of the things we're focusing on and where we're going. So not my actual journey, not the 20 or so hours on a plane, but my journey from a child through university to actually coming back here to Bali today, and why this is a special occasion for me. Starting at the top left, my mother was a human rights activist of sorts, and I spent quite a lot of my childhood on walks and marches and petitions and raising money for Amnesty International and others. Other various causes challenging and advocating for human rights changes around the world. Some years later, I did a PhD in India. I was based in Bangalore, and I looked at the household determinants of child labor in India. And that was a time in 1994 in Bangalore. Bangalore was just hitting the headlines as a tech city, one of India's first tech cities. It was growing very fast, and children were being used not just in traditional ways that they had done in rural areas, but in an urban environment, both domestic labor, but also building some of the infrastructure, the physical infrastructure, and of course in factories, etc. I've got a picture there of Kailash, who you, I hope, all know, was a Nobel Prize winner, along with Malala a couple of years ago, for his work. And I just wanted to celebrate him this morning. When I was doing my PhD fieldwork in the mid-90s, he was gearing up to clearly go to much bigger, better things in the child labor space. And it's fantastic to see the movement he's built. I think in 1998, he did the 103-country global march to end child labor. And he continues today. I then joined the UK Department for International Development, which has kind of semi-rebranded itself these days as UK Aid for all sorts of reasons. And whilst with the UK Department for International Development, I was there for 14 or 15 years, all sorts of roles, including working in the Prime Minister's office, for DFID, for the Foreign Office. Two of the most memorable, most rewarding, and most educational experiences for me were first running the India program, and later the Ethiopia program, and that's the two flags you see here. Coming around to the bottom, you get to the Nike swoosh. And why do you get to the Nike swoosh? In DFID, I was responsible for spending enormous amounts of UK taxpayers' money. When I left Ethiopia, the budget we were spending annually there was about $500 million a year. And it was across education, health, infrastructure, rights, democracy, climate resilience, you name it, we were doing it. and doing it in fairly large, fairly significant ways. But what I saw in Ethiopia, what I saw when I was working in India, what I saw in my career, my 15 years in the British government, was that we were very good, I think we were very good, at the combining political capital with technical expertise and financial capital to address some of the supply side issues of development. And the reason I then surprised myself and surprised my family and friends by moving to the US West Coast to run the Nike Foundation out of the blue, I stumbled across what Nike was doing, which was the main thing in its portfolio at the time was called the Girl Effect. And the Girl Effect was really about looking at the demand side of development and looking at the adolescent girl and looking at how you use the private sector DNA, but the core competencies of a company like Nike, which you might think is actually sneakers and apparel, but it's actually marketing, branding, and communications, and how you use those things for social impact, how you use those things to change and address social norms around the adolescent girl. And the reason why I made that shift, because I could see the schools that we were helping build in Ethiopia, I could see the clinics we were helping finance, I could see the teachers, the health workers, and tremendous growth in Ethiopia from a very low base, some of the fastest progress in social development over a 10-year period, and I happened to have the privilege of being there for part of that time. But I could see that certain groups in the population were excluded, and among them are adolescent girls. And reasons for those exclusion were largely around social norms, which is why I made the shift across. We spun Girl Effect out of Nike after I was been there 2 or 3 years. It's now a social enterprise based out of London. The logo there, Zatu, is one of a portfolio of youth brands which Girl Effect has built over the years, where it uses a combination of infotainment. It uses music and films and dance and poetry and other means, both digital and analog, to talk about the issues that youth want to talk about and need to talk about, to go with the grain of culture, but in doing so to gently and delicately, as I say, within the grain of culture, to address some of the issues that are holding girls back particularly. So Zatu is a brand, a youth brand, and a band that launched about 2 years ago in Malawi. There are similar brands in Rwanda and Ethiopia, and one coming in India and Nigeria. And if you go online and have a look at that stuff, it's quite special now what's happening. And in Malawi, it's very particularly focused around looking at the relationships between boys and girls and allowing them to have a conversation where a relationship between an adolescent boy and a girl doesn't have to be a sexual relationship. You can actually be friends. But it also gets to a whole bunch of other issues which matter to girls, such as violence, such as economic security, such as health, etc. And then I made the move earlier this year to the End Violence Partnership. And the reason I made that move was I had no idea that 1 in 2 children experience violence every year. I had no idea. And when I was met with the fact that 1 billion kids a year, that's about 1 in 2, experience some sort of violence. And by violence, we define it as the Sustainable Development Goal 16.2. So it's everything from corporal punishment to female genital cutting, to trafficking, to online abuse and sexual exploitation, et cetera, et cetera. It's very broadly defined, but it needs to be broadly defined because, as you know, as experts and practitioners in this space, the violence goes right across in all shapes and forms against children. So I was blown away by the fact it was 1 billion children, but I also saw a partnership which had just come out of the starting blocks, and at a moment in time, as I said at the start, which I think is historic, where collectively we can make a significant difference. So the End Violence Partnership is 2 years old, and we feel right now that there is great momentum, and here's why. First of all, just over 3 years ago, September 2015, 193 heads of government agreed to the Sustainable Development Goals, as we just heard from a colleague from the Indonesian government. That's a head of government commitment to the whole 17 SDGs, and bear with SDG 16, and you get to 16.2, and you have a commitment that those 193 heads of government made to end all forms of violence, abuse, and neglect against children by 2030. There's also an urgency here, because that's now only 12 years away. It's about to be about 11 years away. 2 years later, in July 2017, 1 year later, in July 2016, the End Violence Partnership was launched by the then Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, with the explicit aims of catalyzing high-level political commitments to do something quite specific around ending violence, beyond just the broad SDG 16.2 commitment, to encourage collaboration among partners such as this, and to accelerate action on the ground. Around the same time, the Inspire strategies, the 7 strategies of Inspire, which I imagine many of you are familiar with. I'm not going to go through each of the letters of Inspire today, but what struck me about Inspire when I first came across it was there aren't many things in the international development space or the international arena where a broad collection of multilateral agencies, international NGOs and others have a line behind something saying, this is about the best we know right now, and of evidence-based strategies, 7 evidence-based strategies, which if you implement them will give you a fair shot at ending all forms of violence against children. So that launched around the same time as the partnership. On the top right of this slide is a slightly grayed out slide of a solutions summit that was held in Stockholm in February this year, bringing together 400 or 500 policymakers, heads of UN agencies, corporate leaders, NGOs, academics, media, faith groups, and others. The first time, I think, that a gathering of that size, of that nature, and that high level, including a couple of heads of government, had come together around the issue of ending violence against children. So it was quite a special, quite an energetic moment in time. Some of you might have been there. But out of that came a sort of renewed, 1.5 years into the End Violence Partnership, I think a renewed injection, if you like, an acceleration, injection of adrenaline and acceleration into the work we're doing. And of course, all of that's great, but how does it actually make a difference on the ground? So at the bottom, in the corner here, the map with the orange on it, is a snapshot of Pathfinder countries. And I'll speak more about that later on. But that's a mechanism. The Indonesian government signed up to be a Pathfinder country. It's a mechanism by which governments can join the End Violence Partnership, and we offer certain forms of support and help for them to put together and implement a national action plan to end violence against children. So that's all great. Global goals, Secretary General launches the partnership, Solutions Summit, Inspire framework, we have the evidence, and a growing momentum of countries joining the partnership. We had 13 Pathfinder countries in January. We now have 23, and we have a bunch of others knocking on the door, and we have ambitions to increase that number significantly, not for the sake of it, but because we strongly believe that unless countries are on a pathway to having some sort of comprehensive, costed, measured national action plan, we're not going to get to zero by 2030. But then I've got the logo here from the Me Too movement, which many of you will be familiar with. That's not specifically about ending violence against children, but I think it speaks to something that's going on more broadly in the zeitgeist, if I can call it that, that we see attitudes that have, frankly, attitudes and behaviors which have for far too long been tolerated are no longer tolerated. And I think we'd love to see some of the feeling, if you like, behind the Me Too movement coming into the end violence arena, the end violence against children arena. So that gives us hope, amongst other things that are going on in this changing world, that actually we are waking up to things that are unacceptable, inappropriate, and should not have been tolerated and are no longer being tolerated. And violence should be one of those. And I'll say more about 2019, because I think we see an unprecedented historical opportunity in 2019 to really push this agenda forward. And I'm going to get the hang of this pointer as I go. Our next 3 years, we have 3 broad strategic priorities. Growing demand for change, mobilizing resources for everyone, and equipping practitioners. And these are not 3 silos. These are intended to be 3 mutually reinforcing, to an extent mutually interdependent parts. And under each of these sits a whole bunch of activities in our portfolio. I'm going to speak to some of them today. But in essence, the right-hand side is where the rubber hits the road. Practitioners are those who are on the ground, whether they're practitioners, policymakers, advocates, those who are working in communities, in governments, in civil society organizations, researchers and others, day in, day out, to try and improve the lives of children. But the other 2 pieces, the growing demand for change and the mobilizing resources, is vital. Because I think we have to raise awareness, we have to share information, we have to raise awareness to much bigger and new audiences about ending violence against children if we're going to catalyze and create significant additional demand for there to be change, for there to be the high-level political leadership and change, but also corporate leadership, faith leadership, and leadership across other sectors. A couple of weeks ago, I was in Abu Dhabi at the Interfaith Dialogue with high-level leaders from 7 or 8 of the world's largest religions who signed the Abu Dhabi Declaration of what they're going to do both within their religions, within their faiths, but also beyond, because they reach huge audiences. And I call them audiences, they're congregations, but they reach 2 billion or more people every week. So the influence they have around norm change, etc. That conversation was specifically around online abuse, but it's an example of the sort of new groups we need to be reaching and new communities we need to be pulling into the conversation. The mobilizing resources piece is critical. I don't think it takes huge amounts of money to end violence against children, but it does take some money. It doesn't cost what some other social impact initiatives cost. We know that, but it does take some money, and we need to make sure that we have enough money. And we see as part of our role as a global initiative to help make the case and then help mobilize those resources for everyone who is working to end violence against children. Okay, still not getting the hang of this. This is not exhaustive, but it's about trying to start thinking about, okay, well, if as a community we want to grow demand for change, what's the kind of messaging that we're going to need to have? Where does violence happen? And we've had debates internally about where does violence happen, what sorts of violence happens, and you can go down each of those, and they're all very important, because we know, and you know better than I do, those who've been in this field longer than I have, how complex it is, but how we must treat the child holistically at the center of all this. But very broadly speaking, and I'm grossly oversimplifying, and I know that, most violence against children happens at home, at school, or online. And for the at-home piece, we could say at home or in the community. And there are some other examples I know in crises and conflict, etc. But if we keep it simple, and this is about some of the things we have to do as a community, when we know and are familiar with the deep granularity of the research, the evidence, the data, etc., how we get messages more simple. I'm not saying this is a cut and dried message, but I think there's something to be said, and I've found certainly in all the conversations I have, when I talk to people about the very long-winded partnership, which I'm involved with, and some of the stuff we do, people glaze over. But when I say it's 1 in 2 kids and most violence happens at home, at school, online, they get it. But each of these things also gives us a fairly unique way in to trying to tackle violence against children. Home is obvious. School is a unique place where children should be safe and where there is government accountability for them to be safe and to learn at school. And the online space I'll say a little bit more about in a minute, because it's one of the fastest growing spaces of child sexual exploitation and abuse. We're in the process with partners with UNICEF, with the British government, with UNESCO, the Global Partnership for Education, and others, of an organic rolling launch, if you like, of a campaign which we're calling Safe to Learn, which is about ending violence in and through schools. The reason we're doing that is because, as I just stated earlier, children should be safe at school. They should be safe to learn. That's a place they go. It's a place that children uniquely go, physically, and they should be safe, and they expect and they deserve to be safe at school. Secondly, as with all of the SDGs, but this one particularly, this is a global issue. I mean, violence against children is a global issue, but corporal punishment in many schools and violence between children and between teachers and children in schools is also a global issue. And thirdly, we know, and I put in brackets here, enough. We know enough about what works to end violence in schools, and here I've written very deliberately in and through schools, because I think if we look at ending violence in schools and the Safe to Learn campaign, people understand, people who are not yet part of the conversation, the wider public understand, they want their kids to be safe at school. They get that. What we know, though, is that you can't actually have children completely safe at school if you don't look at the child more holistically, the journey to and from school, what happens the night before, what happens the morning after, et cetera, et cetera. So you actually have to have a conversation about the child more broadly, which is why we say it's in and through schools. So it's not only a win in terms of ending violence in schools, it's also a win that will improve learning outcomes when violence in schools go down. But thirdly, it's a win because it will actually is a gateway to have a broader conversation around violence against children in the community as well as in schools. Tackling online child sexual exploitation and abuse. This is, as I said, one of the fastest growing, probably the fastest growing type of violence against children that I'm aware of. And it's truly frightening. I mean, I hang out some of the time with the tech companies, with the law enforcement agencies in Southeast Asia and Europe and the USA, with the legislators. And there's a conversation going on between tech companies and legislators and security agencies. Frankly, there's no magic bullet for tech to fix this. There are things they can do and will do. There's no magic legislative bullet to fix this, and there's no magic security piece. Each of those matters, but also the broader holistic approach to ending violence against children is going to be what really helps us win with children who are at great risk in the online space. And when I say here the scale, the growth, the severity, the complexity, what that means, the scale already is very, very large. It's growing very fast as more and more people come online. I think earlier this week we heard from the International Telecoms Union that half the world's population is now online. And the growth in children coming online is actually the fastest accelerant in all of the online growth that we're seeing. The severity is, another word for that, frankly, would be depravity of what's happening. This has gone in a 10 or 15-year period from pedophiles in one country and another exchanging photographs with each other by email, right through the advent of social media, and now live streaming, and now people paying on demand to have children abused for their pleasure. And so there's clearly a criminal element to it, but it's also the complexity of dealing with this is that it's also multi-jurisdictional. It crosses borders. Other forms of violence also cross borders, but maybe more than others, this really crosses borders, because you might have someone who is essentially prostituting their child in one country for the pleasure of a person in another country, and a third person is providing the tech platform, and a fourth person on the dark web is running a criminal business which links the two together. And the complexity of that jurisdictionally is a real headache that legal agencies and security agencies are trying to get their heads around. But I share that just because it's growing fast. We have a fund, an end violence fund, which with generous contributions from a few donors, which has so far invested about $23 million in helping trying to tackle child sexual exploitation and abuse online. It's an area where there is a growth in funding because people see the very visibly the growth of the problem. And why I say there are opportunities here is because tech also has to be an opportunity. Tech has to be part of the solution. As I said, it's not a magic bullet, but I think a combination of the things I mentioned, plus the broader approach to ending violence, it does provide us with opportunities, which I can speak more about, of how we might actually address online sexual exploitation and abuse. What's this big opportunity in 2019? Very briefly, there are three intergovernmental UN moments in 2019, which are falling by coincidence in the same year, which give us the backbone of a historical opportunity. The first, in July, is the high-level political forum, where ministers come together, as they do every year, to review progress against 4 or 5 of the global goals. This may feel a bit arcane and a bit distant from some of you if you're not familiar with the UN system, but it matters because of those 193 heads of government who signed up to the global goals, the SDGs. So this July, SDG 16, and therefore 16.2, progress against that will be reviewed in New York in July at a ministerial level. Every 4 years, heads of government review progress against all the SDGs. And that's happening for the first time this September at the General Assembly. And then in November this year, it is the 30th anniversary of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. So we see, and when I say we, with the collective we of the partnership, we have 350 members, we collectively see this as a huge opportunity when there is going to be probably unrepeated political attention intergovernmentally through the UN system, July, September, November, as the backbone for raising awareness, showcasing solutions, showcasing what's working, and inspiring new political and financial commitments. So we see 2019 as a really big year for the End Violence Against Children agenda. Something else we have coming is an investment case. And we really feel that we must protect and reserve the rights-based case on which so much child protection work and end violence work has got to where it's got to today. But we need to equip practitioners more with the arguments to make domestically, beyond the very large global numbers which we've had from organizations like No Violence or initiatives like No Violence and others, which are great and have taken us thus far, $7 trillion opportunity cost of violence against children. But that's a little bit meaningless when I think at a country level, as I've been told, and you're negotiating for a budget to actually get something done within government, or you're looking outside of government. And so what we're doing is preparing something which will look both at the cost of interventions to end violence against children, but also the return on an investment. And the idea is that it's something that will be applicable. It may come out as a model, it may come out as a template, we're not quite sure yet. But in about a year's time, products from this work will start coming out, which we hope, in the hands of policymakers, practitioners, advocates, etc., at the country or the sub-national level, will be really powerful. where you'll almost be able to plug and play and say, okay, this is why we should invest in ending violence against children. We know that violence undermines all other investments in children, their early childhood and later childhood. We know that. But this will enable, in a country or sub-country, sub-national specific context, to plug and play those numbers. So that's a piece of work which is about to launch in 2019. Pathfinders. I mentioned we had 13 Pathfinders in January. We now have 23 Pathfinders, pathfinding countries, and we are confident that number will grow. And there, as I said earlier, and I'll restate, it's not growth for growth's sake. And I shouldn't say this where Sabine, who actually is sitting in the front row, who does all the hard work on this, and credit to Sabine and her team for what they do with our country engagement. So close your ears when I say this, Sabine, is that I don't really care if a country is a pathfinder or not. What the essence of pathfinding is that a country has an explicit political commitment to end violence against children, an identified senior focal point within government, coordination and convening of stakeholders across and beyond government, preparation of a national action plan, a costed national action plan, early conversations about resource mobilization to fund that plan, implementation of the plan, monitoring, evaluation, measurement, learning as the plan goes. And that's the essence, really, of pathfinding. As I say, we have 23 Pathfinder countries in government now, and what we aim to do when they come in is both, first of all, help catalyze that initial political commitment, but then provide, tailored to what they need, a mix of solutions, evidence, expertise, resources, and even inspiration. I mean, they tell us that being part of something bigger than themselves, and you'll see from the countries who are Pathfinder countries, there's a great variety in there, and there are very different stages in their ending violence against children journey. UAE, Tanzania, Indonesia, Sweden, Canada, very different places on the journey, and they need different things, but they bring different things as well. Challenges and opportunities for the child protection space. And these, I'm sure, are things you're familiar with. But these are some of the things that we know. These are some of the things that we bump up against, or you bump up against, or practitioners bump up against and tell us they are bumping up against. And thinking through, how are the ways that we might actually address some of these things? How can we look at some of these challenges and not be overly optimistic or naive, but how can we look at them and say, okay, well, how do we turn this? How do we leverage this into an opportunity? So some of the challenges you're familiar with, leadership and resources. Leadership is really around, in my experience, the ministries in government which are responsible for children or youth are often the weakest ministries. I don't know why that is. I could speculate why that is, but in my experience around the world, that seems to be the case. And often children or youth gets bundled together with a whole bunch of other issues. I've seen ministries of like youth, sport, and ICT, and it varies. And it's for each government, obviously, to decide. But the critical point is often the government leads on children, structurally, legally, are weaker ministers within government, which is why the opportunity is about how do we strengthen them? How do we equip them? How do we empower them? How do we resource them to convene and coordinate? How do we equip them with the investment models I just talked about that would enable them to make a more persuasive investment case of why we should invest in children? So that's one part of it. Resources, I mentioned. Technical capacity and turnover. I don't know if there's a simple answer to this one, but I know it is an issue of growing that implementation capacity, growing the technical capacity, the expertise, like many of you in the room, but also we see turnover of people in some of these key roles in and beyond government, which can be a constraint. Reporting versus prevention, that's really around, in some countries, there tends to be a leaning towards reporting incidences, which is important to both not just have the reporting, but response mechanisms in place for children. But we know that the higher value add, the higher return on your investment is actually prevention. And so I wouldn't drop the reporting and the response piece, but we need to look at maybe getting a more of a proportionate balance in some places. And again, making the evidence-based case for it. That's what CPC is about. It's about the evidence base for this kind of work. And it's the evidence and the data we need to make this case. I just made my fourth point by accident, the lack of evidence-based programs. And then a fragmented response. And this really is around that coordination across and beyond government, where multiple agencies within and beyond government very often have a role and responsibility of some sort in a child's life. How does that happen in a way that's less fragmented? How does that happen in a way? And we think through the pathfinding process that one way that can happen is those various actors come together. They bring whatever they uniquely have to bring as part of preparation of that plan, that national action plan, and then they collectively are implementing, and they're seeing the child holistically and not as someone across multiple ministries. I'm going to mention one other thing from this slide, which is involve children. We know the voice of children is so incredibly powerful. I was in South Africa about 10 days ago at the Global Citizen Festival, where we brought together about 120 youth from around the world to prepare a youth manifesto as part of the Safe to Learn campaign. And I'm always reminded when I'm in a room of children or young people, the incredible energy and the incredible insights they have into their experience and what would make a difference. And I know that many of you do work with and listen to children. I just sort of call that out as something that we need to make sure that we are doing appropriately and adequately and proportionately and meaningfully. So it's not just tokenistic in the work that we do. This is my and finally. And if there are any statisticians in the room, any numbers people, I mean, you're all experts, so this is not science. What I'm about to show you is not science. I'm prepared to defend this to a point. It's really meant to be provocation and food for thought, which I want to leave you with at a very macro level. Is how do we get to zero by 2030? What are the sorts of things that need to happen when you're working right at the granular level with every single child whose life in which we need to make a difference? How does that translate up to something at a very macro level? One part, let me just go back. One part is countries implementing plans. And as I said earlier, I deliberately not said pathfinding countries. That's a concept we have. It's a vehicle which works for many countries. It won't work for everyone. The critical point is you need to have that comprehensive, resourced or costed, resourced, implemented, measured national action plan or subnational action plan. The reason why that curve goes like that is because 2015 is when the SDGs were agreed. 2018 is where we are now. This is what we think we can achieve in the next few years, the next 3 or 4 years, because of the historical opportunities we have coming up, and because of the buzz, the momentum, the noise, the political energy behind that we see as growing behind this agenda. And I'll explain in a minute why that then plateaus out. The second line is about finances mobilized. We're confident, not just the work that we're doing, but other partners in the community, that as we collectively grow the assets to make the more persuasive investment case, to do for ending violence against children what we saw in the last 20 years, say, for early childhood development or nutrition or some of the other issues, of why invest in this issue. Let's make that case. We firmly believe that we can make a more persuasive case, and we see the growth in the political commitments and plans to do more, that we will see the resources going into ending violence against children around the world will grow, both domestic resources but also international resources. Evidence and solutions, and this is critical. This is where CPC, PUSKAPA and others come in with the fantastic research, evidence, learning that you do, because that is a fundamental part of this. And this is where this line here in evidence solutions, the lag is, okay, if there's more and more countries coming in here, we're going to know more, but there will be a lag. And then as this goes up and we know more and we have better data and better evidence and Inspire or whatever comes after it, it's even more rigorous and even more robust. The hypothesis is that as that goes up, the countries here who are not yet persuaded, who aren't early adopters or coming in here, may only be persuaded when the evidence is absolutely, the evidence is more rigorous than it is today. So that's the explanation between why the evidence line goes like that and why the countries line implementing plans then goes up. And then the line which matters most, of course, is the prevalence of violence against children. And again, this is not scientific. It's just food for thought of what are the sorts of big trends that we think might need to happen if we're going to genuinely get to zero by 2030. And again, that's not scientific. There's been, a few of us sat around PowerPoint and drew that. We didn't crunch numbers to do this. But we were trying to challenge ourselves and with our ExCom and our board, our governing bodies, to say, how do we really think collectively, globally, we're going to get to zero by 2030? And I'd love to have conversations about this, because this may be right, it may be wrong. But if it's a little bit right, then are we collectively on the right track? And finally, together, we will only do this in partnership. And that's governments, yes, but it's also faith groups, media, academics, corporates, tech companies, researchers, networks, partnerships. We sometimes feel that we're a partnership of partnerships, but we will only get this done together. But I just go back to where I started and why I joined this work and why I joined the End Violence Partnership earlier this year. 1 in 2 children every year experiences violence, abuse, and neglect. We know the impact it has on their development. We know the intergenerational implications as well. And it's incumbent on us, and we have a great opportunity, both here this week, but also coming up in the coming months and years, to make sure that every child, wherever they may live, has the chance to grow up safe and secure. Thank you.